Imagine a world where a wrong step, a careless word, or even just being born in the wrong place could mean your life. Or maybe it means your child's life or your whole family's. It sounds made up, something out of a bad movie, right? But for thousands of years in what we call ancient civilizations, these kinds of rules were real. They were the law. They shaped everything people did, every choice they made. People then lived under systems that seem brutal and unbelievable to us now. Some laws seem to punish the innocent just to make a point. Others gave one person absolute power over another. And sometimes the punishment didn't fit the crime at all. In fact, it often felt like the crime didn't even matter as much as who you were or who you knew. Think about it, we have laws today. We mostly understand them. They try to keep order, to protect people, to make things fair. But these old laws often had different goals. They wanted to show who was in charge. So they wanted to keep a specific group in power. Or maybe they just wanted to scare everyone into behaving. And sometimes they just seemed to make no sense at all. How did people live with such harsh rules hanging over their heads? What did it feel like to know your city might vote to kick you out? Not because you did something wrong, but because you were just too popular. Or to build a house, do your best, and then face death because it fell down. And what if it killed the owner's son? Then your son died too. These are not just old stories. They are windows into how societies worked, how people thought, and what they valued. They show us how different our world is, but also sometimes how some things never really change. We're going to look at some of these truly wild rules. We'll see how they came to be, what they meant for the people living under them, and what they might still tell us about ourselves. Number 15, could your family die because of your house? Imagine building a house for someone. You work hard, you put in the hours, maybe you even think it's a good house. But then for whatever reason it falls down, and it kills the owner. That's bad, right? You should probably be held responsible. But in ancient Babylon, under the famous Hammurabi's Code, the punishment went far beyond what we would ever consider fair. If the house you built collapsed and killed the owner, you, the builder, would be put to death. That was Law 229. Now that's harsh. It certainly makes you think about structural integrity. But it gets worse. Law 230 was even more shocking. It stated, if it causes the death of the owner's son, the builder's son shall be put to death. Think about that for a second. Your work causes an accident. Someone dies. And because of that, your own child, who had absolutely nothing to do with the construction, who might have been an infant, is killed as punishment. This is called vicarious punishment. It means someone else pays the price for your actions. It's an eye for an eye, but taken to an extreme where the eye can be someone else's. Hammurabi's Code, put together around 1754 BCE, is one of the oldest and most complete written legal codes from ancient times. It was carved onto a large stone stele, standing over 7 feet tall, discovered in 1901 by French archaeologists in Susa, modern-day Iran. Today, it's a star exhibit at the Louvre Museum in Paris. The code had 282 laws covering everything from family issues to trade, from property to crime. It was designed to show Hammurabi's wisdom and sense of justice. He wanted to establish order in his vast Babylonian empire. Many parts of the code were about property and responsibility. If a man broke into a house, he was put to death. If a doctor performed an operation badly and a noble died, the doctor's hands were cut off. But the builder laws 229 and 230, really highlight the strictness and the idea of Talayan retribution that ran through the code. The scholars like Martha Roth, who translated the code in law collections from Mesopotamia and Asia Minor, explained that the code aimed for a kind of reciprocal justice. The punishment was supposed to fit the crime, but the idea of fitting was different from ours. It often meant that the social standing of the victim and the accused mattered hugely. A free man injuring a commoner paid a fine, but injuring another free man meant bodily harm. The intent behind Law 230 was probably to ensure builders were incredibly diligent. It put an immense pressure on them. They were responsible not just for their own lives, but for their children's lives too. It was a way to enforce quality control in a society where collapses could be catastrophic. But it's hard to imagine the fear and anxiety this must have created for anyone working in construction. The idea that your son could die for your professional error is almost unimaginable today. We also have to remember the context. In ancient societies, the family unit was everything. A man's sons were his future, his labor, his legacy. Threatening that legacy was a powerful deterrent. But it also raises huge ethical questions. How can a child be held responsible for the actions of a parent? How can justice be served by punishing an innocent person? This law in particular points to a very different understanding of individual responsibility compared to our modern legal systems. It wasn't just about punishing the offender. It was about exacting a cost, sometimes from anyone close to the offender, to balance the scales of justice in a way that truly terrified people into compliance. What did this law actually mean for the average Babylonian builder? Did it lead to better buildings? Or did it just lead to a constant state of terror? And how many builders' sons actually face this ultimate unfair penalty? What kind of society develops a concept of justice where a child pays for a parent's professional mistake? Number 14, was death the only way to handle petty theft? Imagine living in a city where almost every single crime, no matter how small, could get you executed. That's what life was like for people in ancient Athens, for a while under the laws written by Draco. This was around the 7th century BCE, specifically 621 BCE. Draco was an Athenian lawgiver, and his laws were so harsh that the term draconian still means extremely severe today. Before Draco, Athenian law was often unwritten. It was based on customs and enforced by powerful aristocratic families. This led to a lot of injustice, with personal vendettas and inconsistent punishments. So, the Athenians asked Draco to write down their laws. They wanted clarity. They got clarity, all right? But with a horrifying twist. Plutarch, the Greek historian, writing centuries later in his Lives, talks about Draco's laws. He says that Draco made the same penalty of death for most offenses. It didn't matter if you stole a cabbage or murdered someone. The punishment was often the same death. Plutarch famously said that Draco himself, when asked why he prescribed death for most offenses, replied that he considered the smallest of them worthy of death, and he knew of no greater punishment for greater crimes. This meant if you stole some fruit, you could die. If you committed sacrilege, you could die. If you murdered someone, you would also die. The idea was to impose a uniform standard of justice. But the standard was brutally high. This wasn't about rehabilitation or even about fines. It was about ultimate deterrence. The message was clear: don't break the law or you will lose your life. Scholars like Douglas M. McDowell, in his book The Law in Classical Athens, discussed the draconian laws. He explains that while the actual text of these laws no longer exists, what we know comes from later accounts and references. It seems the severity was so extreme that it eventually led to unrest. The common people, who were often the ones committing petty crimes out of necessity, faced the full force of these laws. The aristocracy, on the other hand, likely had ways to circumvent them. The extreme nature of Draco's laws didn't last forever. Only about 30 years later, in 594 BCE, Solon, another Athenian lawgiver, reformed them. He kept the death penalty only for murder and sacrilege, revising most other penalties to be less severe. This shows that even in ancient Athens, people eventually recognized that Draco's approach was simply too harsh to be sustainable. It created more fear and injustice than actual order. The concept of justice requires a scale, a way to differentiate between minor and major wrongs. Draco's laws essentially flattened that scale, making all wrongs equal in their ultimate consequence. Think about the psychological impact of living under such a system. Would it make people more law-abiding or just more desperate? Did it truly create a sense of order, or did it just fuel resentment and rebellion? And what does it say about a society that initially accepted such a brutal code? Number 13. Was weakness a crime worthy of death in Sparta? And ancient Sparta was not like any other Greek city-state. It was a military powerhouse focused entirely on war and collective discipline. Every aspect of Spartan life, from birth to death, was geared towards producing the strongest possible soldiers and citizens. And this focus began literally at birth. One of the most shocking practices, often attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, was the inspection and rejection of newborns. Plutarch, in his Life of Lycurgus, describes this practice in detail. He writes that when a child was born, it wasn't the father who decided if it lived or died. Instead, the baby was taken to a place called the Lesh, where elders of the tribe would examine it. They looked for any physical deformities or signs of weakness. If the baby was deemed ill-favored or misshapen, they ordered it to be cast into a chasm called the apothete, which translates to place of rejection at the foot of Mount Taygetus. They believed it was better for both the child and the state if a weak child did not live. They thought a weak child would not grow into a strong soldier or mother of soldiers, and thus would be a burden on the state. This was not an act of individual parental cruelty, it was state policy. The state decided who was fit to live and contribute to the Spartan ideal. Only strong, healthy infants were allowed to survive and be raised. This wasn't considered murder by Spartans. It was seen as a necessary measure for the survival and strength of their society. It was a cold, pragmatic decision to ensure the quality of their human stock, so to speak. Modern historians and archaeologists have debated the exact nature and scale of this practice. While the chasm at Mount Taygetus has been found to contain human remains, most are of adult males, leading some to question the extent of infant dumping there. However, the literary accounts from Plutarch and others are consistent. Regardless of the exact location or the sheer numbers, the principle was clear: the state had the right to determine the value of a newborn's life based on its potential contribution to the military collective. Sarah Pomeroy in Spartan Women notes that while the archaeological evidence is ambiguous for widespread infant murder, the cultural understanding and historical accounts confirm the state's extreme control over family and life. This law highlights the Spartan obsession with physical perfection and military prowess. From the moment of birth, a Spartan life was not their own. It belonged to the state. Boys, if they passed the inspection, were taken from their mothers at age 7 to begin rigorous military training in the agoge. Girls were also trained in gymnastics and athletics to ensure they would be strong mothers capable of bearing healthy children. The individual existed solely for the good of the state. Think about what this implies about human worth. Is a person's life only valuable if they contribute to a specific societal goal? What does it mean for parents to have no say in the fate of their own child? And how does a society that practices infanticide justify its morality to itself? It's number 12. Did fathers really have power of life and death over their kids in ancient Rome? In ancient Rome, the head of the family wasn't just in charge, he was practically a god within his own household. This power, known as patria potestas, or fatherly power, was immense. It was a fundamental legal concept, particularly evident in the laws of the 12 Tables, Rome's earliest written legal code, compiled around 450 BCE. And it gave fathers an almost absolute authority over their children, even adult children, and sometimes even their grandchildren. The 12 Tables explicitly laid out this power. Tablet the 4th, Law 2, stated something like, "A father shall have the power of life and death over his legitimate children." This wasn't just about discipline or making decisions, it meant a father could legally kill his child. He could also sell his child into slavery multiple times. If he sold his son 3 times, the son was finally free of his father's power. This last part was actually a way for sons to gain independence from their fathers, but it still shows the extreme extent of paternal authority. This power wasn't limited to young children. Even adult sons, who might be leading Roman legions or serving in the Senate, were still technically under their father's patria potestas as long as the father lived. They couldn't own property independently. Any property they acquired, like military spoils, or even their own salary, legally belonged to their father. They couldn't make legal decisions without their father's consent. This state of legal dependency only ended when the father died or in some rare cases formally emancipated his child. Historians like J.A. Crook in Law and Life of Rome, 90 BC AD, 212, highlight how patria potestas was a cornerstone of Roman society. It wasn't just a legal curiosity, it was a deeply ingrained social and cultural norm. While the right of life and death was rarely exercised literally by the later Republic and Empire, the legal foundation remained. It served as a powerful symbol of paternal authority and social order. If a father did exercise this extreme right, he might face social disapproval, but not legal punishment. The family was considered a small kingdom, and the paterfamilias, the father, was its king. The power of patria potestas was also tied to the Roman concept of pietas, a deep sense of duty and respect towards God's country and family, especially parents. Children were expected to obey and honor their fathers unconditionally. This legal framework reinforced a patriarchal society where the male head of the household held immense, almost sacred authority. It was a tool for maintaining social stability and ensuring family lineage, even if it meant denying individual freedom to adult children. Think about the psychological toll this could take. Imagine being a grown adult, perhaps a general or a senator, but still needing your aging father's permission for major decisions, knowing he still technically held the power of life and death over you? What impact did this have on individual ambition and freedom? And how does a society justify granting such absolute power to one person over another, even within a family? Number 11. What happened if you robbed a tomb in ancient Egypt? In ancient Egypt was a civilization obsessed with the afterlife. The pyramids, the elaborate burial rituals, the mummification, all of it was about ensuring a prosperous journey into the next world for the deceased. And because of this, tombs, especially royal ones, were packed with valuable grave goods, gold, jewels, precious artifacts, and food for the journey. This made them irresistible targets for robbers. But the Egyptians took tomb robbery incredibly seriously, and the punishments were utterly brutal. We know about these laws and punishments from various surviving papyri and inscriptions, particularly from the New Kingdom period around 1550 to 1070 BCE. For example, the Turin Judicial Papyrus and the Abbot Papyrus detail investigations and trials related to tomb robberies in the Valley of the Kings during the reigns of Ramses IX and Ramses XI. These documents show a meticulous legal process. Royal commissions were sent to inspect tombs, record damage, and interview suspects. The penalties for tomb robbery were among the most severe in Egyptian law. They included beatings, forced confessions, sometimes under torture, mutilation, and ultimately, death. Mutilation often involved cutting off hands or feet or nose and ears, making the convicted criminal identifiable and permanently marked as a transgressor. Death could come in various forms, but impalement was a particularly gruesome method sometimes used for tomb robbers. This involved being slowly driven onto a sharpened stake, a truly agonizing way to die, meant as a stark warning to others. Tomb robbery wasn't just seen as theft, it was an attack on the sacred. It disrupted the deceased's journey to the afterlife, potentially damning their soul. It was a religious crime, a social crime, and an affront to the divine order. The pharaoh himself, seen as a god on earth, was responsible for the eternal welfare of his ancestors and his people. Protecting tombs was part of his divine duty. Joyce Tildesley's Egypt, Ambitious Failures, Tomb Robbery in Ancient Egypt explores how these elaborate precautions and severe punishments were constant throughout Egyptian history, driven by both greed and spiritual belief. The punishments were not just about retribution, they were about deterrence. The visible mutilation of a convicted tomb robber served as a constant reminder to the living about the consequences of desecrating the dead. The horror of impalement was meant to instill fear so profound that even the allure of vast riches would seem secondary. Despite these terrifying penalties, tomb robbery remained a persistent problem throughout ancient Egyptian history, suggesting that the promise of wealth often outweighed the fear of retribution for many desperate individuals. The very existence of such severe laws and the extensive records of trials tell us just how widespread and troubling this problem was. Think about the desperation that would drive someone to risk such a gruesome fate. What does it say about a society that uses such extreme methods to protect its dead? And how effective can laws be if the incentive for breaking them is so high? Number 10, could your whole family be punished for your crime in ancient China? Imagine a system where if you committed a crime, not only you, but your entire family, and sometimes even your neighbors, would also be punished. This was a core tenet of legalism, a philosophy that heavily influenced the Qin dynasty in ancient China, particularly under Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who reigned from 221 to 210 BCE, and his chief minister Li Si. Legalism focused on a strong centralized government and a strict application of codified laws, believing that human nature was inherently selfish and needed control. The concept of collective responsibility or mutual responsibility was paramount. It meant that families and even wider communities were organized into groups of 5 or 10 households. If one person in a group committed an offense, the entire group was held accountable. This was meant to encourage people to report crimes or, at the very least, prevent them within their own social unit. If they failed to report a crime, they were considered complicit and punished accordingly. The most severe form of this was the extermination of 3 generations or even 9 generations, where not just the criminal's immediate family, but also their parents' families and children's families could be executed. This wasn't just a threat, it was implemented. For example, Sheng Yang, a legalist statesman who served the state of Qin even before it unified China 4th century BCE, implemented many of these policies. His reforms included harsh laws, promotion based on military merit, and a system of collective punishment. Ironically, Shang Yang himself was later executed, and his family was also exterminated. And historian Dirk Bade, in China's First Unifier, a study of the Qin dynasty as seen in the life of Li Su, 280-208 BC, details how these legalist principles, rigorously applied by Li Si, were instrumental in Qin's unification of China. They helped create a highly controlled and efficient state, but at a huge human cost. The aim was total obedience and unwavering loyalty to the state and the emperor. By making everyone responsible for everyone else's behavior, the state created a pervasive atmosphere of surveillance and fear. The idea was to make it so terrifying to commit a crime that even contemplating it would be unthinkable. And if someone did, the social pressure from their family and neighbors would be immense to prevent it or report it. This system did, for a time, create a very orderly society with low crime rates. But it also suppressed individual thought, dissent, and personal freedom. People lived in constant fear, not just for themselves, but for their loved ones. Think about the moral implications of punishing innocent people for the actions of others. How did this impact trust within families and communities? And what kind of society can truly thrive when fear is the primary motivator for obedience? Number 9. What if the river decided your guilt in ancient Babylon? Imagine being accused of a serious crime, something like sorcery, but there are no witnesses. No real evidence what happens. In ancient Babylon, under Hammurabi's code, you might have to face a trial by ordeal. This wasn't just a figure of speech, it meant literally putting your life in the hands of the gods, or in this case, a river. Law 2 of Hammurabi's code laid this out clearly. If a man has accused a man and has cast a charge of sorcery upon him, but has not proved it, the one who is accused of sorcery shall go to the divine river, he shall plunge into the divine river, and if the divine river overcomes him, his accuser shall take his estate. So, you were thrown into the Euphrates River, considered a divine river. If you drowned, you were guilty. Your accuser got your property. But if you survived, if the river showed you to be innocent and you were saved, then your accuser was put to death, and you got their estate. It was a high-stakes gamble for everyone involved. The underlying belief was that the gods, or the divine power of the river, would protect the innocent and expose the guilty. It wasn't about rational evidence or human judgment, it was about divine intervention. The river was seen as a living entity with the power to discern truth. This kind of trial by ordeal was not unique to Babylon. It appeared in various forms across many ancient cultures, from Europe to Africa to Asia, reflecting a common human tendency to appeal to supernatural powers when human judgment seemed insufficient or biased. Francesca Rochberg, in The Heavenly Writing Divination, Horoscopy and Astronomy in Mesopotamian Culture, explores the deep role of divination and divine will in Mesopotamian society. These trials were not seen as random. They were believed to be legitimate means of discovering the truth, guided by the gods. The concept of Misharim, or justice, was tied to divine order. If the gods allowed an innocent person to drown, it was perhaps a sign that their fate was sealed by other divine decrees. But from a modern perspective, this is terrifying. It's a death sentence masquerading as a trial. Whether you lived or died depended on factors completely unrelated to guilt or innocence, your swimming ability, the river's current, your physical strength, or even just dumb luck. It created a system where an accuser could essentially risk their life to get rid of someone they disliked or to acquire their property, knowing the accused faced an almost impossible challenge. And how many innocent people died because they weren't strong swimmers or because the river was too rough that day? What does this tell us about ancient concepts of justice and truth? Did people truly believe the river was always right? Or was it also a way for the powerful to eliminate perceived threats under the guise of divine judgment? And how did society cope with the ambiguity of guilt or innocence when the outcome was so random? Number 8. Could your parents have you stoned to death for being disobedient? Imagine growing up in a society where your parents held such absolute power that if you became a stubborn and rebellious child, they could actually take you to the city elders and demand your execution. And that execution would be stoning. This deeply disturbing law is found in the Old Testament, specifically in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18-21. It describes a horrifying scenario. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, he will not listen to them, Then his father and his mother shall take hold of him, and bring him out to the elders of his city, at the gate of the place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of his city, This our son is stubborn and rebellious, he will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel will hear and be afraid. This law paints a stark picture of parental authority and community control in ancient Israel. It's important to note that scholars often debate whether this law was literally and widely enforced, or if it served more as an extreme deterrent and a symbolic declaration of the importance of filial piety and obedience within the community. The fact that it requires both parents to bring the accusation and then the community elders to sanction it suggests it was meant to be a last resort, not a casual punishment. Nonetheless, the very existence of such a law is staggering. It shows an extreme value placed on parental authority and social order. A son who was stubborn and rebellious, a glutton and a drunkard, was seen as a threat to the stability of the family and the wider community. Such behavior was not just a personal failing, it was a societal evil that needed to be purged. The public stoning was meant to make others hear and be afraid, reinforcing conformity and respect for elders. Scholars like Richard B. Hayes in The Moral Vision of the New Testament discuss how these laws in Deuteronomy reflect the high value placed on the covenant community and its moral purity. Disobedience to parents was seen as a breach of that covenant, a threat to the very fabric of society. The law isn't just about punishment, it's about maintaining social cohesion and religious purity through extreme measures. We don't have records of how often this law was actually carried out. It might have been very rare, functioning as an ultimate threat that compelled children to obey. But the psychological impact of such a potential fate must have been immense. It placed an almost unimaginable burden on parents to decide if their child's behavior had crossed such a line, and on children to constantly conform. What does this law tell us about the boundaries of parental authority in ancient societies? Is it possible for a community to be truly just when it allows for the execution of a child for disobedience? And does the absence of evidence for widespread enforcement mean the law was less impactful, or perhaps even more terrifying because it was an extreme possibility, always hanging over people's heads? Number 7. What was the Roman punishment for killing your father? In ancient Rome, killing your father parricide was considered one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. It wasn't just murder, it was an attack on the very foundation of Roman society, the family, and especially the paterfamilias, the absolute head of the household. The punishment for parricide was uniquely gruesome and utterly symbolic, known as the poena culiae, or punishment of the sack. The details of this punishment are found in Roman legal texts, like those compiled in Justinian's Digest from the 6th century CE, which draws upon earlier Roman law. It was a two-stage process. First, the convicted parricide would be scourged, whipped until blood was drawn. Then, they would be sewn into a leather sack. But not just any sack. This sack contained live animals, a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster. After being sealed inside with these creatures, the sack was then thrown into the nearest river or sea. Each animal in the sack was symbolic. The dog was often associated with impudence and a lack of respect. The snake symbolized deceit and evil. The monkey, a creature seen as a perverse imitation of man, represented the unnaturalness of the crime. And the rooster, a domestic bird, represented the violation of the home. Being thrown into water denied the criminal a proper burial, ensuring their spirit could not rest, a significant additional punishment in Roman belief. This punishment was not just about killing the offender, it was about denying them human dignity, isolating them from humanity, and ensuring a terrifying, agonizing death that reflected the unnaturalness of their crime. It was designed to be publicly horrifying, a clear message that attacking the family, and especially the father, was an unforgivable act. Historians like Richard Bowman, in Crime and Punishment in Ancient Rome, detail the evolution of this punishment, noting its symbolic power and its unique severity compared to other forms of murder. The very concept of patria potestas, the father's absolute power over his family, made parricide the ultimate betrayal. It was an attack on the natural order, an act that threatened the very stability of the Roman state. The poena culiae was meant to purify the community of such a monstrous offense. It ensured the criminal suffered not only physically, but also symbolically, being returned to a state of nature, alienated from human society, and enduring a death that mirrored their unnatural act. Think about the psychological impact of such a punishment, not just on the offender, but on those who witnessed it or even just heard about it. What does it say about a society's deepest fears when it devises such a symbolic and brutal form of retribution? And how did the act of sewing live animals into a sack with a human being reflect Roman ideas about justice and the natural order? Number 6. What if lying to the king in ancient Persia meant impalement? The Achaemenid Persian Empire circa 550 to 330 BCE was vast, stretching from Egypt to India. Maintaining control over such a huge and diverse empire required a sophisticated administration and, crucially, a fearsome reputation for justice and punishment. For many offenses, especially those against the king or the state, punishments were designed to be public, agonizing, and absolute. One of the most horrifying fates, often reserved for rebels or those who lied to the king, was impalement. Herodotus, the Greek historian, often referred to as the father of history, provides many accounts of Persian customs and punishments in his histories. He describes how Darius I, after quelling a rebellion, impaled the leaders of the revolt. While Herodotus's accounts can sometimes be colored by Greek biases against their Persian rivals, other sources, including some Persian royal inscriptions, corroborate the severity of punishments for rebellion and disloyalty. For example, the Behistun inscription, a massive multilingual relief carved into a cliff face by order of Darius I, explicitly describes how rebels were captured, mutilated, and then impaled. Impalement involved driving a stake through the victim's body, usually from the anus or chest, and then erecting it vertically. The victim would then slowly die, often over several agonizing days. It was a public spectacle of extreme suffering, designed to instill terror and absolute obedience in anyone who dared to challenge the king's authority or truthfulness. The crime of lying to the king was not seen as a minor transgression. In a centralized empire, the king's word was law, and his information needed to be accurate to govern effectively. Falsehoods could undermine his authority, his campaigns, and the stability of the empire. Therefore, lying to the king could be seen as an act of treason. The Achaemenid kings, such as Cyrus the Great, Darius I, and Xerxes I, presented themselves as divinely appointed rulers whose authority came from Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrianism. Disobeying or lying to the king was therefore not just a secular offense, but a religious one. Pierre Briant in From Cyrus to Alexander, A History of the Persian Empire, describes how the Persian imperial system relied heavily on an ideology of divine kingship and strict adherence to truth, reflected in their severe legal practices. These extreme punishments, including impalement, flaying alive, and eye gouging, were not just acts of vengeance. They were crucial instruments of state control. They were meant to show the king's absolute power and his divine right to rule. They created a climate of fear that kept distant provinces in check and ensured that subjects, from nobles to commoners, understood the immense consequences of disloyalty or deception. Think about the atmosphere of fear and suspicion this would create. How could people truly trust each other, let alone their rulers, when such fates awaited those who displeased the king? What does it say about the stability of an empire when it relies so heavily on terror to maintain order? And what impact did such public displays of agony have on the psyche of the common people? Number 5 was death the penalty for being drunk in the Aztec Empire. In the Aztec Empire, which flourished in Mesoamerica from the 14th to 16th centuries, laws were strict and morality was highly regulated. While most people associate the Aztecs with human sacrifice, their legal code also contained some surprising and severe social regulations. One of the most astonishing was the death penalty for drunkenness, particularly for younger individuals. Alcohol, typically pelka, an alcoholic beverage made from the fermented sap of the agave plant, was available, but its consumption was strictly controlled. For most adults, especially those under 70 years old, public drunkenness was a serious offense. If you were caught, the punishment was often severe. If it was your first offense, you might be publicly shamed, have your head shaved, or your house might even be demolished. But repeated offenses, or drunkenness by younger people, especially those of high social standing, could result in death by strangulation or stoning. However, there was a key exception. Elderly people, specifically those over 70, were allowed to drink pelko freely. It was seen as a comfort in their old age. Also, warriors might be given pelke before battle, and it was used in certain religious ceremonies. So it wasn't alcohol itself that was inherently evil, but rather its abuse, especially by those who were expected to be productive members of society or uphold moral standards. The Aztecs placed a high value on self-control, discipline, and communal responsibility. Drunkenness was seen as a direct threat to this social order. It led to idleness, neglect of duties, and could incite violence or crime. For a society that was so meticulously structured and relied on collective effort for its survival and expansion, individual self-indulgence was considered dangerous. Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar who arrived in New Spain shortly after the conquest and meticulously documented Aztec culture in his General History of the Things of New Spain, also known as the Florentine Codex, provides detailed accounts of Aztec laws and customs, including the severe penalties for excessive drinking. The severity of the punishment also depended on social status. A noble who became drunk and shamed his lineage might face a quicker and more discreet death than a commoner. This reflects how Aztec society used laws not just for general order, but also to reinforce the hierarchy and the responsibilities that came with different social positions. The leaders and those in power were expected to embody the highest virtues of temperance and discipline. Think about the cultural values that would lead to such a harsh law against intoxication. What does it say about the Aztec emphasis on order, productivity, and social control? And how did people, knowing the potential consequences, navigate social gatherings where alcohol might be present? Number 4 was laziness, really a capital offense in the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire, which dominated the Andes region of South America from the 13th to 16th centuries, was a highly organized and efficient state. It didn't have a written language in the way we understand it, but it had a complex social, economic, and political structure governed by a strict set of principles. 3 core principles guided Inca life: Amakela, Amalula, Amasua. These translate to do not be lazy, do not lie, do not steal. And while do not be lazy might sound like a parental admonition in the Inca Empire, failing to uphold it could have incredibly severe consequences, potentially even death in extreme cases. The Inca economy was based on collective labor. Everyone had to contribute to the state through a system called maita, which was essentially a labor tax. This meant working on state lands, building roads, terraces, temples, or serving in the military. There was no concept of individual wealth or private property in the same way we understand it. Everything revolved around the community and the state. Therefore, laziness, or kela, was seen as a direct threat to the entire system. If people didn't perform their assigned duties, the intricate network of food production, infrastructure, and military would collapse. The chronic idleness or refusal to perform maita duties was not just a social faux pas. It was an act against the state, a disruption of the divinely ordained order. While simple laziness likely led to reprimands, public shaming, or harsher labor assignments, persistent and egregious laziness, especially if it impacted crucial state projects or supplies, could be seen as an act of rebellion, and rebellion was punishable by death. John Hemming's The Conquest of the Incas and Garcilaso de la Vega's Royal Commentaries of the Incas, though written by a Spanish mestizo with a romanticized view, describe the strict moral code and the harsh penalties for deviating from it. The Inca system had no police force in the modern sense. Instead, it relied on a strict hierarchy of local and regional administrators who ensured everyone performed their duties. The threat of severe punishment, including death, served as the ultimate deterrent. It reinforced the idea that every individual's labor was vital for the functioning of the empire. This collective responsibility meant that one person's laziness directly harmed everyone else. It's difficult to find specific historical records detailing executions solely for laziness, in the same way we have records for theft or murder. However, the omnipresent principle of Amakela and the known severity of Inca justice for offenses against the state suggest that persistent idleness, if it rose to the level of sabotaging the collective effort, would certainly not have been tolerated and could indeed have led to capital punishment. The Inca state was an authoritarian regime where the individual's purpose was to serve the empire. Think about the psychological pressure of knowing that not contributing your full share could lead to the ultimate penalty. How did this focus on work and collective duty impact individual creativity or personal aspirations? And what does it mean for society to elevate not being lazy to such a fundamental life or death principle? Number 3, could debt force you into slavery in ancient Egypt? Debt has been a problem throughout human history, but in ancient Egypt, for a long period, unpaid debts could lead to a truly terrifying outcome: forced labor or even a form of temporary slavery, not just for the debtor, but potentially for their entire family. This was particularly prevalent during the New Kingdom circa 1550 to 1070 BCE, and later periods when economic pressures and social stratification were significant. We learn about these practices from various ancient Egyptian documents, including administrative papyri, legal texts, and personal letters. These documents record cases where individuals unable to repay a loan were compelled to work for their creditors or even for the state to settle their obligations. Sometimes this meant working on the creditor's land, in their workshops, or in their household. In more extreme cases, individuals could be forced into state labor, for example, working in mines, quarries, or on large construction projects, to clear their debts or the debts of their families. It wasn't always a permanent, hereditary form of chattel slavery like that, seen in other societies. Often, it was a temporary form of debt bondage or servitude. However, the conditions could be incredibly harsh and the period of service might extend for many years, effectively consuming a significant portion of a person's life. And it wasn't just adults. Children could also be handed over as collateral or to serve as laborers to repay a parent's debt. The debt could effectively enslave generations. Jack J. Jansen, in his late Ramside Letters and Communications, offers insights into the economic realities and social hardships faced by ordinary Egyptians, where debt often became an inescapable trap. The state, too, played a role, sometimes enforcing these debt contracts, and at other times even creating debt through taxes or levies that couldn't be paid, leading to forced labor on state projects. The pharaoh was the ultimate owner of all land and resources, and the common people were effectively tenants or laborers in a vast state enterprise. The idea behind it was simple: if you couldn't pay with money or goods, you paid with your labor. This was a system that ensured creditors had a way to recover their losses, and that the state had a ready supply of manpower for its projects. But it created a highly vulnerable class of people, always at risk of losing their freedom and subjecting their families to the same fate. It also meant that economic misfortune, a bad harvest, or a run of bad luck could have devastating and long-lasting consequences for personal liberty. Think about how this system would affect social mobility and economic stability. What hope did people have of escaping poverty if a single debt could lead to generations of servitude? And how did a society which built such grand monuments reconcile such a system of forced labor with its sense of justice and divine order? Number 2 were spies and assassins tools of state in ancient India. Ancient India, particularly during the Mauryan Empire circa 322 to 185 BCE, saw the development of one of the most ruthless and comprehensive treatises on statecraft ever written, the Arthashastra. Attributed to Kautilya, also known as Chanakya or Vishnugupta, the chief minister to Emperor Chandragupta Maurya, this text is a guide for kings on how to acquire and maintain power, govern effectively, and crush enemies. And within its pages, it explicitly details the use of spies, assassins, and psychological warfare as legitimate tools of the state, alongside laws on various forms of torture. The Arthashastra is a stark and pragmatic work. It recommends a vast and intricate spy network, with agents disguised as ascetics, merchants, householders, physicians, and even women, spread throughout the kingdom and in enemy territories. These spies were not just for intelligence gathering, they were also used for disinformation campaigns, sowing discord, and even assassinating rivals, both foreign and domestic. Kautilya's philosophy was clear: the ends justified the means when it came to state power. He believed a king must be vigilant and ruthless to ensure the prosperity and security of his kingdom. The text also details a legal system with very harsh punishments, including various forms of torture to extract confessions or punish criminals. These methods were not just physical, but psychological. For example, the Arthashastra describes how prisoners might be deprived of sleep, starved, or subjected to intense interrogation. For certain crimes, mutilation was a common punishment. This wasn't just about justice, it was about projecting absolute power and maintaining fear as a deterrent. This Patrick Olivelle, who provided a critical translation of the Arthashastra, emphasizes its Machiavellian nature, predating Machiavelli by nearly 2 millennia. It's a handbook for totalitarian regime, outlining how to control every aspect of life, from commerce to religion, to ensure the king's authority. The use of secret agents and covert operations was not considered morally ambiguous. It was a necessary and professional part of governance. The text even describes specific poisons and methods of assassination to eliminate threats discreetly. The Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta and his grandson Ashoka, who later famously converted to Buddhism and advocated for nonviolence, was a powerful and centralized state. Kautilya's strategies, as outlined in the Arthashastra, were likely instrumental in its establishment and initial expansion. The vision of the state in the Arthashastra is one where law and order are maintained through absolute control, surveillance, and a readiness to use any means necessary, however brutal, to ensure the king's dominance and the empire's stability. Think about living in a society where you knew spies were everywhere, potentially even your neighbors, and where the state openly sanctioned assassination as a political tool. How would this constant surveillance and threat of covert action affect trust, free speech, and personal dissent? And what does it say about the nature of power when it openly embraces such morally dubious methods for governance? Number 1, could a popular vote exile you in ancient Athens? Imagine living in a democracy where citizens have a say in their governance. Well, sounds good, right? But in ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy, there was a peculiar law that allowed citizens to exile one of their own, not for a crime, but simply for being too powerful or popular. This was called ostracism. It was introduced by Cleisthenes around 508 BCE as part of his democratic reforms. Here's how it worked once a year. Athenian citizens could vote on whether to hold an ostracism. If they decided to proceed, then on a specific day, they would gather in the Agora public square. Each citizen would scratch the name of the person they wanted to exile onto a piece of pottery called an ostracon. If at least 6,000 votes were cast, and one person's name appeared on the majority of the ostraca, that person was ostracized. This meant they had to leave Athens within 10 days and stay away for 10 years. Their property was not confiscated and their citizenship was not revoked, but they were effectively banished from their home and political life. The purpose of ostracism was not to punish a criminal. It was a preventative measure. The Athenians feared tyranny. They wanted to prevent any single individual from becoming too powerful, accumulating too much influence, and potentially overthrowing the nascent democracy. It was a safety valve, a way for the people to remove a perceived threat to their collective freedom without actually accusing them of a specific crime. The idea was to nip potential tyrants in the bud before they could seize power. Famous Athenian figures like Aristides the Just, Themistocles, and Cimon were all subjected to ostracism at different times. Plutarch recounts an anecdote about Aristides. An illiterate citizen approached Aristides, asking him to write Aristides' own name on an ostracon for him, not recognizing Aristides. When Aristides asked if the man knew Aristides, or if Aristides had wronged him, the man replied, "No, nor do I know him, but it annoys me to hear him everywhere called the Just." This story, whether entirely true or not, perfectly illustrates the underlying fear of excessive influence, even if that influence came from positive qualities. M.H. Hansen, in The Athenian Democracy in the Age of Demosthenes, explains that ostracism was a unique and powerful tool that reflected the Athenians' intense commitment to their democratic ideals and their deep-seated suspicion of individual power. It showed the direct power of the people to shape their political landscape, even if it meant removing popular leaders. The practice eventually fell out of use by the late 5th century BCE as it became clear that it could be manipulated by political factions to remove rivals. Think about the profound psychological impact this had on Athenian politicians and citizens. What would it be like to live in a system where your success, your popularity, or even your reputation for being too good could lead to your banishment? How did this system balance the need for strong leadership with the fear of tyranny? And what does the eventual decline of ostracism tell us about the long-term viability of using a popular vote to exile individuals without specific charges?